Hey everybody, welcome to part 6 of my Why I Love Between the Bear and Me White Walls series. As usual, please check the description box for links so you can jump around to different parts of the video, as this is probably going to be a long video. If this is the first video you're watching in the series, I want to recommend you start from episode 1 so that way you can understand how we got here, why we got here, and why we're doing things the way we're doing things. In part 6 we look at a section that starts at around the 4-minute and 28-second mark of the track. Compared to the previous episode and previous section that we looked at, this is very tonal. We get descending triplets, cool riffery, a climbing melodic section, some nice proggy riff, and a nice relaxing Airy section. We even get to see a couple of familiar faces. The ambiguity and harshness from part 5 contrasts strongly to part 6, which is what we're going to do today. Part 6 is melodic and catchy, and the previous one was pretty brutal. This balance of chaos and harmony is a huge part of why I love BT Bam in the first place, and the section goes hand in hand with part 5. In the words of Diatonically, it all makes sense. We're capable of beauty through sounds that make one cringe. Anyway, here's the playthrough. So this section follows the D minor chord from the last progression in our previous video with a descending triplet 8th note measure. According to Dan, this section was written at the same time as Son of Nothing and Ants of the Sky, so it kind of gives us a similar feel between all three of these songs. It kind of gives a sense of cohesion within everything. We could dismiss this fill as simply going down the G major scale in diatonic thirds. We can also look closer to see this as an actual transition. It gives us a kind of bridge going from D minor to E minor, which will be our new key that we go back to from our previous D minor key. Starting the scale from C instead of G, D, or B also makes it seem intentional. So that first part starts on C. The second guitar part also repeats one triplet in the middle of the whole phrase, so it also makes things intentional sounding. So we have the repeat after the second triplet. When we look at both parts at the same time, we can see some implied chords with passing tones in the middle of each triplet trio. We have the E, C, and A notes, which make an A minor, and the B, G, and E make an E minor. The upper voice then repeats the previous triplet, resulting in a G major chord from the B, G, and D, and the lower B note. The last trio gives us F sharp, D, A, and a lower F sharp, resulting in D major. The A minor makes sense coming from D minor. That would be the 5 chord in D minor, the minor 5. This is also a good pivot chord because it's also the 4 chord in E minor. The next chord is E minor, which is our 1 chord, followed by G, which is our 3 chord, and then we get to our 7 chord, which has dominant function and leads us back to E minor, re-establishing the key of E minor. So we end up with this. The next few measures can also be seen as being in 9/8, but I like looking at them as alternating groups of 5/4 and 4/4 due to the implied chord changes that happen. The alternating 5/4 and 4/4 also makes more sense with the accents coming from the drum part. I will say that the 9/8 version does look a lot better and a lot cleaner in terms of the guitar part. It makes things a lot easier to understand, but I don't think that's what's actually happening here. We start off with a very E minor sounding run where all the strong beats are part of the chord until the last 2 beats. So what we would have would be the E, then a passing tone which is F sharp, then G, then another passing tone A, going to B, and then we get an upper neighbor tone which would be the C, which is kind of like an embellishment because of how fast it is, and then we descend back down. We could see this as an E minor measure, and we can apply this way of thinking to the rest of the measures in this section. But we could also pay attention to those last 2 beats and see how they outline an F sharp diminished chord with the A and F sharp landing on strong beats. This not only leads us into the G chord in the next measure by a half diminished resolution, because it's E and not E flat, but also creates a bass movement by step, because we're going from E, F sharp, and G. We follow a similar pattern in the next 4/4 measure, which is in G. But we can also see an A minor happening towards the end of the measure that's clearly shown. So we have A minor here. Or A minor 7 if you want to include that G in there. Another thing I want to kind of mention on this part, when I was learning it, we tend to kind of leave our fingers down when we have a 3 note per string thing, so we would do and leave everything down. If you're learning this, I would recommend that you kind of let go, because we're not going to have to do any pull-offs, we're not going to have to. So I would recommend doing this. Lifting the fingers after you've played them, it frees them up for the next part. And you won't have your hand cramping up. Just a little tip. So in the next pair of measures, we start off with a 5/4 measure that outlines the 4 chord and basically an A minor chord, leading into what looks like the 5 chord in a B minor type of measure. Until we look a bit closer at the last 2 beats. The last 2 beats can somewhat imply an E tonality, so we would get something like this. And that's kind of based off the E power chord, so we can kind of see this as an E minor 7 kind of bit, with the A being used as the way it was in the intro riff, as the kind of 1 to 4 progression happening over and over again. Because there's no F sharp in this B minor measure, we could also view this entire measure as being an E minor 7 type of measure, I guess in second inversion, if you want to say that. The 4 chord going to 5 or 1 would both make sense, but I think the stepwise bass movement makes a lot more sense with B minor. We then go to our 6 chord, which is C, followed by the 7 chord, which is D. Similar to how we saw in the last beats with the G major measure, these last 2 beats can also be seen as an E minor type of chord, which is the chord that follows, so it's kind of like an anticipation kind of thing happening here. The next measure outlines an E minor. We then go to a measure like the others that can be interpreted in 2 chords if we decide to. I see the first half as an F sharp minor 7 flat 5 and the second half as a B minor-ish type of thing. I'm calling an F minor 7 flat 5 because there's an E natural in that measure, and it's the diatonic 2/7 chord. Even though the second half is a whole step higher than our previous pair of measures, instead of calling it an F sharp minor measure, we see the fifth and root of a B minor chord, which is our 5 chord, with that same stepwise motion from 4th to 5th that we saw previously. Either way, if we see this as an F minor 7 flat 5, a B minor, or a vague F sharp diminished 7 chord, this measure has dominant function, like we can draw back to the E minor or we could go to a G, and it kind of does. So if we condense everything down, we get a pretty cool and logical chord progression. So we would end up with something like this. After this, we then go into a 5/4 octave pedal type of riff. We're using the low E as our kind of pedal note. We can then see what is mostly an E minor based measure with the exception of A notes. We could look at these A notes as implying A minor, which is the 4 chord in E minor. This makes a bunch of 1 to 4 relationships, which has been done before previously in the track. The second guitar does a similar riff, but the non-E notes are up an octave. After the building we create with our previous section, this riff really helps to kind of establish the importance of E again. So we would end up with, the octave riff. The lower octave would be this. And the fretted notes up an octave would be this. Towards the end of all this, we get a 3/4 measure that helps us transition into the 4/4 part. Again, we can see this as a bunch of 5/8 measures with a 6/8 measure to help it clean up and make it all look linear, but it doesn't line up with the drums, so we're going to look at it differently. We then get this really cool part that starts off with octaves that are outlining an E minor. So we get this. We get E, B, E, and then G. The slide to the G is a really cool touch, just sounds a lot more fluid. This leads us into the next part of the lead that emphasizes the interval of a 6th. It's harmonized in thirds with the 2 lead guitars, so that adds another kind of textural third inverted 6th kind of thing that's happening. When I was watching the Colors Live DVD, this is the fingering that Paul uses for the section, so he does this. There's nothing wrong with this fingering, but when I think of 6, I think of, country music kind of stuff. Because I think of 6 from a country music perspective, this is the fingering that's easiest for me and makes the 6th more apparent, so I play it like this. You stay on the same string set for longer, and if you want to let the notes ring, you can go ahead and let them ring if you want. The country approach is cool too when you remember that there's a bluegrass section in Answer the Sky, so that kind of helps everything seem like it's making a lot more sense. I'm comparing it to how Paul played it on the Colors Live DVD, but I'm not sure how he's playing it nowadays, so it's very possible that he could have adapted it and made it easier, or maybe he did this for tonal reasons and that's why he does it like this. The harmonized guitar part goes like this. Dusty doesn't play the harmony on the DVD, but I'd like to think he uses this fingering because he's a good old country boy. While this is happening, the rhythm guitars are doing something like this. We get these cool octave chord stabs that are going between E and D octaves that help support our original analysis and reinforce that E minor type of sound. When we look at all 3 of these parts, we can see an implied chord progression that the first octave measure implies an E minor. In the next measure, the rest and the D octave on the upbeat and the rhythm guitars helps to imply a G chord when paired with the harmonized guitars. The E octave then implies an F sharp minor 7 flat 5 type of thing, followed by an E minor or E minor 7 if you want to count the D octave. In the 2/4 measure, I'm ignoring the E octave. It's on an upbeat and the rest of the guitars imply a D. So we would have something like this. We have the 1 chord going to the 3 chord, then the 2-7 flat 5, then we go to the 1 chord, then the 7 chord, and then we end on the 1. We then get to a transition measure that takes us back to our cool main riff from part 1. This transition measure is a harmonized version of the original transition from the doubled 16th note riff from the intro. We end up with an implied E minor 7 due to the accented 7th in the second melody part. The importance of E minor is established once again as we head into the main riff. That main riff being... The reprise of our main riff is business as usual until we get to the end, that is our transition measure, which is basically 2 A power chords that are fading out. We then get to this cool, airy arpeggio section that strongly contrasts our recent heavy, groovy type section. I've seen this transcribed in a bunch of different ways, but this is the way that makes the most sense for me. I see it as a bunch of 7/8 measures, and that's how I hear that first measure. I see a lot of transcriptions that include the lower G octave on beat 4, but that's not what I'm hearing this first time the pattern comes out. It would make sense to kind of keep the picking pattern the same throughout the whole thing, but it's not what I'm hearing. On the Colors Live DVD, it shows Paul play it, but only once, and it's really tough to see what he's doing. Either way, the octave isn't going to affect how we look at this measure. I'm kind of seeing it all as an E minor add 11 type of chord with an A in the bass. I'm saying the add 11 because of that A, and we're sliding into it, so we have that kind of... And it's held throughout the entire measure, so it seems pretty important. You could also call it an A minor 7 without the third. Calling it an E minor at 11 reinforces the importance of the tonal center of E, so that's what I'm going to call it. After several repeats of this, we end up to the next arpeggio, which is a B7 sus 4. So we get something like this. That would give us the 1 to 5 movement. We really don't see any D or D sharps, but we see a B, F sharp, and an A, along with our E, our suspended 4th. We could also see this as E sus 2 at 11 with a B in the bass, which would keep our previous root, but we would lose our 5 to 1 type of relationship, so I like calling it the B sus 4. After a few repeats, we go back to that previous E minor at 11 arpeggiated section, but with a few changes. We now have this 2 measure type of phrase that repeats instead of just that 1 measure that keeps going on and on. I included the lower G that we didn't include earlier to have that consistent picking pattern, and I think I hear it now. You know, it could be, mind trickery, but I'm hearing it that time. You start hearing a bunch of things once you hear something a million times. And then that second measure is mostly the same with the exception of the last 3 notes that's descending from the higher G if we ignore that lower G. So we would have and if we ignore the octave, we would have this. While all this is happening, the second guitar part enters with a 1 measure pattern that repeats over this 2 measure pattern. Once again, we get a different take on the E minor at 11 pattern. So we end up with something like this. If we combine the two, we end up with something that looks like this. I think it's really cool that we don't see any voice crossing here, and it's not straight harmonizing in thirds. The harmony reinforces our original chord interpretations, and we get more melodic accompaniment with separate voices, more independent voices. That last group of 3 notes could easily have been harmonized in thirds, but keeping the same pattern gives us more voice independence. So I think it's really cool that they didn't switch for that one part and just do it in straight up thirds. We then return to the B7 sus 4 pattern with a new second guitar part. This part took me a lot longer than I would like to admit. This measure shows the guitar 2 crossing into the lower voice of the 2 guitar parts. That made it tougher to figure out who was doing what because they're both in a very similar range. I found a video where Dusty is using this fingering, and with this fingering, the A does not sustain, so we end up with the F sharp and D being sustained. The D shows that technically this is a B minor 7 sus 4 kind of thing because the 4th E resolves to a D natural, not a D sharp. Either way, it's not a big deal. While all this is happening, we get the only vocals and lyrics we're going to get in this section. Step back, evaluate, recognize. It's almost like they wanted me to analyze this section, right? The vocal reinforces the accents from the drums with this step back part. I have them lined up here with the first guitar part to see where they land. I put the accent marks to make it a little more clear as to where the vocals are landing. The vocal part repeats this 2-bar phrase over the 2 chords. Step back is actually a very appropriate lyric, looking forward to what's coming up in a bit. Evaluate and recognize almost mimic our volume swells as they accompany the step back part from our guitar parts. We then go to 4/4 time with a pair of suspended chords with the D and C sus2 chords. So we get this. They could also be seen as A sus4 and G sus4. That would create a descending bass line from the previous B sus4 chord, but we have D and C in the bass, so I'm calling them D and C sus2. This leads us to an E minor triad. We should also note that the D to C is a step back, in this case a whole step back. That lyric could have been a cool heads up to all the parts that are kind of coming up. If we condense this section down, we end up with a progression that's something like this. I use a different fingering to help with the chaos of this screenshot. With the E minor at 11 going to B7 sus4, we see the E and A in green stay the same. What changes is the G going to B in orange. Or the G and A could both move up to an A and B as a pair in whole steps. We also see the addition of a higher F sharp, which is kind of like the E note splitting into 2 separate voices. I circled this pair in purple because, as you can see, this pair of notes descends down the E minor scale by step, from the B7 sus4 to the D sus2 and then the C sus2. All 6 of these notes step back, again by whole step. When looking back at the A and B in the B7 sus4 chord, the orange area, we see it move up to one voice, an A note. The A can stay the same, the green arrow in the tab, and the B can go down by step to A, the orange arrow. Another thing to note about the B7 sus4 to the D sus2 transition is to bring up Dusty's harmony part. With the addition of the second guitar, we get a D in the last beat of the measure. The suspended 4th from the B7, E wants to resolve down to the 3rd, and the second guitar not only creates a B minor 7 chord for that moment, but also aids in the transition to the D sus2 by anticipating the D a beat early. The transition from D sus2 to C sus2 is a whole step back down. The C sus2 then goes to an E minor by the D going up to an E by step, the green arrow. The C goes down by half step, the blue arrow, and the G stays the same, the orange arrow. We then begin a chain of descending triads that are all based off of this same kind of motif. We get this. Everything once again starts to step back, but this time it's by half step. The first 3 measures show us going from the 1 chord to the 1 sus2, then we go to the 5 chord in first inversion using half step motion. After the 5 chord, we use half step motion to go to a minor chord that is a half step lower than our original chord. The process then starts all over again with this new chord that's a half step lower. Here we see the 3rd G going down to an F sharp by half step to create the suspended 2nd. Usually suspended 2nds want to resolve up to the 3rd and go back to E minor, but instead the E note goes down by half step to D sharp, which gives us the B major in first inversion because D sharp is in the bass. Again, B wants to go to E minor or E major, but instead the B goes down by half step to A sharp, resulting in a D sharp minor chord. The B chord can also be seen as the 6th chord in the key of D sharp minor, making it a great pivot chord. All these half step motions create a very smooth transition from chord to chord. This kind of line cliché is used in all kinds of music. Once in D sharp minor, we repeat this entire process and we get to D minor. The A sharp / C double sharp chord can also be seen as a B flat / D chord because they're enharmonic equivalents. A sharp is B flat, C double sharp is D. Once in D minor, we continue this process and we get to an A chord. The A chord is not only the 5 in D minor, but it's also the 4 chord in E, making it a great pivot chord that leads us to E minor, using a kind of modal interchange kind of thing. We then do a repeat of this entire section until we get to the A chord again. Instead of going back to E minor, the C sharp goes down by half step to C to create an A minor. The middle note E then goes down by half step to E flat to create an A diminished triad. The C then goes down by half step to create a B7 chord because E flat is the same thing as D sharp. We're keeping the A note as the same as before. With the B7 being the 5 chord in E minor, we would expect an E minor next, but instead we go to A diminished. So we end up with this. This is smooth because, as before, the D sharp is the same thing as E flat, and we only have to change the B back up to C by half step. This entire section is like a study in the power of the half step. There isn't a 7th, G flat or F sharp to create a diminished 7, but we've used the F sharp diminished 7 in the past to go back to E minor, and we're keeping that going here by going back to our Viridian progression. I told you it would come back. I didn't realize it was going to take almost 2 hours to get here. And that's it for this episode. So thank you for enduring part 6 of my Wild Love Between the Buried and Me series. We got to see some chord scale-like progressions, some crazy time signature sections, lyrical foreshadowing, suspended chords, and cliché half-step harmony kind of stuff. I think ending on the Viridian part is a cool way to kind of stop for this section for, a short period of time. School's starting to pick up and I'm not sure when the next part's going to come up. Part 7 is already in the works. I'm trying to outline it, figure out what I want to talk about. I'm getting around to finishing the layout and hopefully recording it soon, but I'm not sure when that one's going to come out. I hope to continue with my 1 video per month goal, so stick around because there's going to be more content, whether it's Between the Buried and Me related or not. And the best way to do that is by subscribing. Please give me some feedback by giving me a thumbs up or leaving a comment. Got my social media profiles and links down in the description box if you're into that kind of thing. And once again, thank you for watching and thank you for all of your feedback. And until next time, see ya.